Ever had one of those weird thoughts that just sneaks into your brain early in the morning and refuses to leave? Like a tiny voice saying, "Hey, have you ever actually paid attention to what your body is doing?" Because that's exactly how this strange little experiment started for me. Not in a lab, not after reading some big medical book, but on a random sleepy Tuesday morning when I was standing in the bathroom, half awake, holding a cup of coffee in one hand, staring into space like most of us do. And suddenly, the question popped up in my head, so casually, it almost made me laugh. How much urine does my body actually produce in a day? And what does that say about my health? Now I know what you're thinking already. This is a weird topic, maybe even slightly uncomfortable. And yeah, I thought the same thing at first. But something about that moment stuck with me, because the truth is, we spend our whole lives talking about health in big dramatic ways. Diets, workouts, supplements, blood tests, all that stuff. Yet we ignore the simplest signals our bodies send every single day. And urine is actually one of the biggest signals there is. It's like a daily health report card from your kidneys and metabolism. But most of us treat it like background noise. Flush and forget, never thinking twice. And that morning, I realized I was one of those people too, completely unaware of what my own body was telling me. So I did something kind of ridiculous, but also kind of fascinating. I decided I would track my urine output for 30 days, just to see what happens. Nothing fancy, no lab equipment, just a notebook, some curiosity, and maybe a little bit of courage, because honestly, it felt strange even admitting this idea out loud. And when I told my friend about it later that day, he laughed so hard, he nearly spilled his drink and said, "Man, you really need better hobbies." But I didn't care. Something about the idea kept pulling me back. And sometimes those weird ideas are the ones that teach you the most. So that night I grabbed a simple notebook and wrote a title at the top of the first page that made me chuckle a little. It said, 30-Day Hydration Experiment. And under it, I wrote the date, and right there the journey started. Though I had no idea yet how much this small, strange habit would change the way I look at my body forever. The first day felt awkward. I'm not gonna lie about that. Because suddenly something I'd ignored my whole life was getting attention. And attention changes everything. I started noticing things I'd never noticed before. Like how the first bathroom trip in the morning was always smaller than expected, and the color was darker. Which actually makes perfect sense when you think about it, because your body has gone hours without water while you sleep. But realizing it in real time was oddly fascinating. It felt like my body was saying, "Good morning. By the way, you're dehydrated." And that alone already told me something important about my habits. Because if the first signal of the day says you need water, maybe coffee shouldn't always be the first thing you drink. But of course, I still drank the coffee, because I'm human and mornings without coffee feel illegal in America. But I also added a big glass of water afterward and wrote it down in my notebook. And suddenly, my day had this tiny new awareness built into it. A small moment of checking in with my body instead of rushing through life on autopilot. And that might sound simple, but it's surprisingly powerful. Because most people live years, even decades, without truly noticing their body's patterns. We notice pain, we notice illness, we notice dramatic changes. But the quiet daily signals usually go completely ignored. By the third day of my little experiment, something interesting started happening. I began noticing patterns, not just random bathroom trips, but actual patterns connected to what I ate, what I drank, and how active I was during the day. And it hit me pretty quickly that my hydration habits were honestly kind of terrible. I had always told myself I drank enough water. You know, the usual thing people say when they don't really measure it. But when I actually started paying attention, the truth came out fast. Some days I barely drank 2 glasses of water while still going through multiple cups of coffee and maybe a soda later in the afternoon. And that realization was both funny and slightly embarrassing, because we all like to believe we're doing better than we really are. But numbers don't lie, and my notebook definitely wasn't lying. It showed me clearly that my body was trying to work with whatever hydration I gave it, and sometimes that wasn't much. Then came the first surprise that really made me pause. Around the end of the first week, I noticed something about my energy levels that I had never connected to hydration before. On days when I actually drank more water, my afternoon fatigue wasn't nearly as bad. You know that heavy, sluggish feeling that usually hits around 3 o'clock when your brain starts slowing down and you feel like you could fall asleep at your desk? Well, it was still there, but it wasn't nearly as intense. And that got my attention because I always blamed that feeling on work stress or lack of sleep. But maybe dehydration was playing a bigger role than I realized. And that thought alone made the experiment feel less silly and more meaningful. Because if something this simple could affect my daily energy, then maybe there were other hidden connections too. Around day 10, another observation popped up that honestly made me laugh. Because once you start paying attention to urine color, you realize it's basically a built-in health signal system. Lighter color usually means better hydration, while darker color often means your body needs more fluids. And suddenly, every bathroom trip felt like checking a small status update from my body. Not in a weird obsessive way, but in a curious way. Like a scientist casually observing patterns. And sometimes those patterns were surprisingly clear, especially after workouts or long busy days when I forgot to drink water regularly. Those days the signals were obvious, and my notebook captured every little detail. And while writing it down, I couldn't help thinking how funny it would sound if someone looked over my shoulder and asked what I was doing. Because explaining that you're documenting urine patterns for 30 days definitely sounds strange at a dinner party. But here's the funny part. The more I talked about it with friends, the more people admitted they had never thought about it either. And suddenly, the conversation shifted from laughter to curiosity. Because deep down everyone wants to understand their body better, we just don't always know where to start. By the middle of the month, the experiment started affecting other parts of my daily routine in ways I didn't expect. For example, I began carrying a water bottle more often. Not because some health guru told me to, but because I could literally see the difference it made in my body's signals. And when you see something with your own eyes, it becomes real in a way advice never does. And that realization reminded me of something older generations often say, especially people over 60 who have lived long enough to see how small habits shape long-term health. They always talk about listening to your body, paying attention to simple signals, and not waiting until something goes wrong to start caring about your health. And suddenly, I understood what they meant in a much deeper way than before. Somewhere around day 20, there was another moment that stuck with me. I had a long, stressful day at work and barely drank water for hours. I was focused, rushing through tasks, ignoring the little signals of thirst that popped up now and then, and by evening, I felt exhausted. Headache creeping in, energy completely drained. And when I checked my notebook later that night, the pattern was obvious again. Low hydration, darker color, smaller output. And it felt almost like my own body was saying, I tried to tell you earlier, and that moment made me realize something important about health in general. Our bodies are constantly communicating with us, but we often ignore the messages until they get louder. And sometimes those messages start small and simple. A little thirst, a little fatigue, a little change in color or frequency. Yet those signals are valuable information if we're willing to notice them. By the time the final week arrived, I had developed a rhythm that felt natural rather than forced. I drank water more consistently throughout the day, paid casual attention to my body's signals, and wrote quick notes in my notebook like a quiet observer documenting the story of my own health. And honestly, the biggest lesson so far wasn't about urine itself. It was about awareness. The simple act of noticing what your body is doing instead of rushing through life, distracted by a million other things. Because awareness has a funny way of improving habits automatically. When you see patterns clearly, you naturally start making better choices without needing dramatic rules or strict diets. And that small shift in perspective was already making this experiment worth it, even before the final days arrived and revealed something even more surprising than I expected. And by the time the last stretch of the experiment arrived, I realized something strange had happened without me even noticing it at first. Because what began as a goofy little curiosity had quietly turned into a daily ritual of awareness. And the funny thing is, when you start paying attention to your body in even the smallest ways, your whole perspective shifts a little bit. Almost like adjusting the focus on a camera lens, and suddenly things that used to look blurry become clear. And during those final 10 days, I caught myself thinking more deeply about habits, about aging, about the way our bodies change over time, and how often we ignore those changes until something forces us to stop and look. And maybe that's why older people often talk about health differently than younger ones. They've had more time to notice patterns, more years to realize that the body whispers before it shouts. And that idea kept echoing in my mind every time I opened that little notebook and wrote another observation in it. Sometimes just a quick note about hydration. Sometimes a random thought about energy levels or mood. And over those final days, the patterns became even clearer than before. Almost like the story my body was telling had finally reached the part where everything connects together. One afternoon during the last week, I remember sitting at my desk around 3 o'clock. The exact time when I used to feel that heavy afternoon slump that made me want to grab another coffee just to stay awake. But that day something felt different. The fatigue wasn't nearly as strong. My head felt clearer. And for a moment, I just sat there thinking about what had changed. Because my workload hadn't changed. My sleep schedule hadn't changed much either. Yet the difference was noticeable enough that it made me pause and reflect. And when I looked back through the notebook pages, it hit me like a small, quiet revelation that had been building all month long. I had simply been drinking water consistently. Not perfectly, but consistently enough that my body had started running more smoothly. And it felt almost ridiculous realizing that such a basic habit could make a visible difference. Because modern life often makes health seem complicated with endless advice and trendy solutions. But sometimes the fundamentals still matter the most. Of course, not every day during that final week was perfect. There were still moments when I got busy and forgot to drink enough water. And those moments became the most interesting ones, because the signals from my body appeared again almost immediately. A slight headache, a dry mouth, a drop in energy that crept in quietly like a fog rolling across the afternoon. And once you've spent weeks observing patterns like this, you can't unsee them anymore. It's like learning a new language your body has been speaking all along, but you finally understand a few words now. And that realization gave the whole experiment a deeper meaning than I expected at the beginning. There was also something unexpectedly funny about it all, because every time I told someone about the project, their reaction followed the exact same pattern. First confusion, then laughter, and finally curiosity. People would say things like, "Wait, you actually wrote that down every day?" Or, "What did you even learn from that?" And I'd smile and explain that it wasn't really about the urine itself, but about the patterns behind it. The hydration, the signals, the awareness of how daily habits shape how you feel. And almost every person I talked to admitted they had never paid attention to something like that before, which made me realize this weird little experiment might actually be more relatable than it sounded at first. Somewhere around day 25, there was a moment that stayed with me because it showed just how automatic our old habits can be. I had gone several hours without drinking water again while working on a project, completely absorbed in what I was doing. And when I finally stood up, I felt that familiar heaviness behind my eyes and that slightly dull headache starting to form. And the first thought that popped into my mind was, I need coffee. But then I stopped and laughed quietly to myself, because after weeks of tracking my body's signals, I knew exactly what was really happening. It wasn't caffeine I needed, it was water. And sure enough, after drinking a couple of glasses slowly, over the next hour, the headache faded and the fatigue eased up. And moments like that might sound small, but they reveal something powerful about the way we misunderstand our own bodies sometimes. We treat symptoms without asking what's actually causing them. And often the simplest explanation is the correct one. During the final 3 days of the experiment, I found myself flipping back through the notebook pages more often, looking at the early entries from the first week and comparing them to the later ones. And the difference was surprisingly clear, even without complicated measurements. The early days showed inconsistent hydration, darker color patterns, and more notes about fatigue or headaches, while the later days showed steadier habits and fewer complaints about energy levels. And that comparison made me smile, because it felt like watching a small personal transformation unfold in slow motion. Not a dramatic transformation, like a movie montage, but a quiet, steady improvement that came simply from paying attention. By the last day of the month, I woke up with a strange mix of amusement and pride, because the experiment was technically over, but the awareness it created wasn't going anywhere. I went through the usual morning routine and realized that checking in with my body had become second nature, almost like brushing my teeth or tying my shoes. And that's when the biggest lesson finally settled in my mind with surprising clarity. The value of the experiment wasn't the data itself, but the habit of observation it created. The simple practice of noticing what your body is telling you before problems grow bigger. And that lesson felt especially meaningful when I thought about how many people ignore those early signals for years. When I closed the notebook later that evening, I couldn't help laughing again at how strange the whole idea sounded at the beginning. Tracking urine for 30 days definitely isn't the kind of hobby most people brag about. But the truth is, it taught me more about hydration and daily health awareness than any article I'd ever read. Because experiencing patterns yourself always hits differently than hearing advice from someone else. And the experience reminded me of something I once heard from an older neighbor who was well into his 70s and still full of energy. He once told me that the secret to staying healthy longer isn't complicated routines or miracle supplements, but simply paying attention to the body's quiet signals every day. And back then I nodded politely without fully understanding what he meant. But now, after a month of observing my own patterns, I finally understood the wisdom hidden in those simple words. The truth is, our bodies are constantly communicating with us through small signals that appear so ordinary we overlook them. Thirst, fatigue, sleep quality, digestion, even something as basic as urine color or frequency. And when we ignore those signals long enough, the body eventually has to speak louder, sometimes through illness or chronic problems that could have been prevented with earlier awareness. And that thought alone made the experiment feel surprisingly important despite its humble beginnings. Looking back now, the funniest part might be how reluctant I was to start it. Because like most people, I initially thought the idea sounded awkward and maybe even pointless. Yet by the end of the month, it felt almost obvious that paying attention to hydration and bodily signals should be a normal habit rather than a strange experiment. And I realized something else too. The modern world trains us to focus outward constantly on screens, deadlines, notifications, and endless information, while our own bodies quietly run complex systems in the background without much attention from us. And maybe one of the most valuable things we can do for our long-term health is simply redirect a small amount of attention back inward again. So if you're listening to this story right now and thinking it sounds a little unusual or maybe even slightly funny, that's perfectly okay, because I thought the same thing at first. But let me ask you a simple question that might make you pause for a moment. When was the last time you actually paid attention to the signals your body sends every single day? Not just when something hurts or feels wrong, but during normal, ordinary moments when your body is quietly telling you how it's doing. Because those small signals can reveal patterns about hydration, energy, and overall health long before bigger issues appear. And that's why, before we finish this story, I want to leave you with a small suggestion that might sound simple, but could change the way you understand your body over time. Tomorrow morning, start a tiny experiment of your own. Nothing complicated. Just pay attention to your hydration and how your body feels throughout the day. Maybe even write a few quick notes for a week the way I did. Notice when you feel energetic and when you feel sluggish. Notice whether drinking water consistently changes anything about your mood or focus or sleep. Because awareness often leads to improvement naturally, without forcing yourself into strict routines. And if this story made you smile or think, or maybe even feel curious enough to try something similar, go ahead and share your thoughts in the comments and tell me honestly how much water you drink in a normal day. Because chances are many people will realize they're in the same situation I was at the beginning of this experiment, believing they're hydrated enough while the body quietly disagrees. And who knows? Maybe a small conversation about something as ordinary as hydration will inspire someone else to start paying closer attention to their own health signals too. After all, wisdom about the body doesn't arrive suddenly in a dramatic moment. It grows slowly through awareness, observation, and the willingness to learn from everyday experiences, even the slightly awkward ones we usually ignore. And sometimes the most unexpected experiments end up teaching the most valuable lessons about how to take care of ourselves as the years go by.